So what is it about getting older, perhaps, or perhaps being from this country, that makes us a little more inward focusing? You heard at one point there was some suggestion that, should I have learned this in school? And the question was, the answer was, well, yes, I probably should. But what is it that makes us somewhat unaware of other things outside of where we are right now at this specific time, specific place? It can be hard, can't it, to keep this idea of what's going on all over the world. Now, what I would say is, on some level, there's a reason for that. The truth is, you are wired biologically to know details about your immediate family, maybe the small community around you, maybe your village, but actually when we've got to this point of trying to know about the whole world, we actually get into real difficulty. It's really hard to keep that perspective. If I say to you 500,000 people died in a typhoon in the Philippines, that is a long way away. It can be hard to get into any set, like what perspective, what does that mean? It just feels so distant from us that our bodies or our minds shut down to a certain degree and we move to this inward-facing direction. It's hard to keep an outward-facing posture to the rest of the world that's so far away from us in so many ways. That's why when something happens here, which may be very important, that affects a far smaller number of people, it affects us to a far greater degree. If you think back to several years ago, there were the Boston bombings. It was no doubt a tragedy. 3 people died. But the same day in Baghdad, 90 people died. That seems distant from us. That seems far away. We can't comprehend that. So we shut it out, and the things that are closest to us affect us the most. Now, I don't think it's unnormal. I think there's a reason for that. But I do think that it might be that as we look at today's topic, there's a chance that God asks us to be a little more outward focusing than we are at times. We've been walking through this series that we've called Directions. Our goal has been to take seriously the process of change. We're going through change as a community, and every single one of you has been through change at different points of your life. Some of you are going through change right now. We started with that sense of when you experience change, maybe it's grief from losing a loved one, maybe it's a change in a job situation, maybe it's a change in a church community. The most important step is to look backwards. You don't just try and keep going. You actually take seriously the fact that grief is an important part of being human. Taking time to look back and say, that hurts. It may not feel fair, it may not feel right, but taking that time to grieve and say, I have lost and it hurts, is okay. Change is loss, and loss brings grief, and that can be so disorientating for us as human beings. But the encouragement we had is that in that moment of experiencing that loss, after looking backwards, to take that time to look upwards to this God who is above all of that. This God who somehow says that I have the universe in my hands. It will be okay. You will get through this, as impossible as that it seems to be right now. It's that decision to look upwards to this God who is big and reliable. And that then when we do that, we get this idea of that God moves us forward. He actually gets us moving again and into the new things that he has for us. Maybe as a community, we think about the new things that God has for this community. Eventually, God moves you on in your life. You'll never forget the part that you've lost, perhaps, but there are new things for you. There is a new promise for a new day, and God takes that seriously and asks us to take it seriously as well. But as we move forward, what we've done the last couple of weeks is we've kind of asked this question. So we're moving forward as a community. What kind of community is this anyway? What kind of community is this? It's an important question. Every community has like a guiding principle. We looked at a couple of famous companies that have these guiding principles that tell you how to run those companies. Every community has a guiding principle. If you join a club of some kind, it has one. Think about joining a climbing gym. You may not have to climb if you join it, but everyone there would think you were kind of weird if you paid and didn't enjoy climbing. If you didn't climb regularly, they'd suggest that, well, do you really want to belong to this club? You may be wasting your money. They have these guiding principles, systems that they work around. And we said that this community, and maybe every community, has both inwards and outwards focus. So we looked at that first Jesus community, and we said this Jesus community was built around this idea of the Spirit that empowered them. It was a community that decided to put first the idea, this is me for my community. This is me for my community. The other option, my community for me, just didn't work. Most of the stories that you read about in the Old Testament seem to have more of that principle. My community for me. We looked at a story of Achan and how Achan just lived this essentially selfish life. It was about what the community did for him. And our challenge was, how do we think about me for my community? And how do we embrace this New Testament life of being empowered by the Spirit? We talked about the idea that these first followers of Jesus, they weren't rowers, they were sailors. There was this idea of this wind of the Spirit that caught hold of them and empowered them. And we had this image of a sailboat like this, that just had this sense of like, we're not working. There's something in us that is empowering us into this Jesus life. We get to be like Jesus, not because we're trying really hard, but because this God is somehow dwelling inside us and he's giving us our power. But it can't stop there in just that inward focus. There's always also this sense of outward focus as well. What is it for a community to look outwards from itself? And this is what I'd love to challenge us to do today. Today, we're going to look outwards. Next slide. This is this idea of it's not just me for my community. That's important. But then there's this idea of my community for the world. Think about another statement that's similar to that. There's this Arabic proverb that I really love. It goes something like this: me versus my brothers, or against my brothers. Me and my brothers against my cousins. Me and my cousins against the world. It kind of makes sense when you think about it. It's this family environment that comes first, but it kind of flips this idea here. It's all really based around who you're against. We want to think, well, what are we for? What does it mean for a community, our community, to be for the world outside of it? What does it mean for us to turn outward focusing, not to become inward focusing, but to turn outward focusing as well? So we're going to go back one more time to our Joshua community, this group of people that we have followed through the desert. They've come to a large river, the Jordan. They've crossed it miraculously. They've conquered this huge fortress, Jericho, through God's supernatural provision. Everything has gone well. They've experienced problems in the community as certain people haven't lived up to what the community expectation was. But they've generally gone into this new land, and God is doing incredible things for them. So we're going to go back to them and look at them one more time. And what we're going to start with is the idea that this community has a backstory. Now, everything has a backstory. Every nation, every community, everything of any kind has some kind of story to it. Think of the American story. The American story is centered around 1776. There's something that happened there that is so important to us as a nation, it grounds almost everything that we do. There's other stories that will come up, and they'll change that story, or they'll tweak it, and they'll bring some new aspect to it. Think about 9/11. 9/11 has become part of our national fabric. Something that was thought to be impossible happened, and the country has not been the same since. There's other parts to our story, maybe parts that we forget that are important as well. One might be June 19th, 1865. That was the day that someone stood up and said, this thing, slavery, that we're using to operate our country, that isn't the way God wants us to operate. We're going to take that and we're going to cancel it. We're going to say no more. This isn't who we want to be. That story too is massively important to our national fabric. So nations, communities have these stories behind them that explain who they are. And this nation, this community of people that we're going to read about is no different. Their story starts way back, some 400 years before we're reading right now. It starts with a guy called Abraham. So let's have a look at this history and see why outward was so important to this community to begin with, and why if they lost their outward focus, they'd lost some part of who they are. The Lord, that is God, said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So think about what this is saying. It's talking about this nation is going to be blessed. But they also have this bigger purpose. They are going to bless, and if you're unfamiliar with the word bless, that's fine. It's kind of like a good things. It's going to, this nation will do good things for the whole world. They are going to do that for everybody. So this community is God's answer to what I would call the crack in the windshield. So you guys are New Yorkers. You've experienced that horrible feeling of what happens when you have a car. It's the middle of winter, and suddenly there's this line that appears in the windshield, and there's the question of, what do I do with this? I think there's a picture of a delightful crack in a windshield. And the truth is, if you're my wife when we first met, the answer is you'll leave it for a year in the hopes that somehow it will just disappear. But we know what happens to cracks that you just leave. They just get worse and worse. There's this slow spreading effect. Maybe this crack began from a first chip or a couple of chips that connected, and then suddenly the whole windscreen is a mess. This is what is happening to the world at this point in Genesis 12, where we've just read. God has made a world, it's good, it's fallen, it's become sinful, and slowly, the whole thing seems like it's been unraveling, and God has decided, I'm going to deal with this through this one family, through this person, Abraham, who I will take and I'll make a community that lives the way that I would have them live, but not just for them. Eventually, it's going to go out to the whole world. So an easy way to understand what God is hoping they'll do is the sense of tribalism. I love this time of year because I get to see this kind of thing on my television. I get to enjoy the joyful experience of Go Blue Michigan football. It's my second faith, my deep, held conviction. We were awful yesterday against Army, but I'm deeply passionate about Michigan football. This is tribalism. You guys have a team, I'm sure, and there's something about it that says, I am on this team's side. So just picture, we'll split the room for a second. We'll say that you guys over here, you guys are Michigan, and you guys are Ohio State. You guys are Michigan, and you guys are Ohio State. Or pick another rivalry. Pick Yankees versus Red Sox. Pick something that you can get that sense of what tribalism means. Tribalism is actually a good thing. In this world, back here, hundreds, thousands of years ago, it was important. It was how you survived. A good parent had a child. That child was born egocentric, as all children are. They scream when they want something. They're demanding. And eventually, through the right education, these children get to become what we call ethnocentric. They get the sense of there's a bigger value here. Maybe it's my immediate family, maybe it's my clan, maybe it's my village, but we are in this together. And I get to suddenly have this value of, no, this is bigger than me. This is about the thing we talked about last week. This is me for my community. But then there's something that's supposed to happen, which becomes rarer. Picture you guys, you're at this football game, you're at this baseball game, you've got Yankees versus Red Sox, and you kind of dislike the people on the other side, and you guys in the middle, I'm sorry, I don't have a team for you, you get to be the official or something like that. But there's this sense of we're into the game, and it's the World Series, the Yankees are up 2-1 or something, it's intense, it's there, and you're in the moment, and then something happens. Then, one of your guys, the other guys on the Red Sox team, takes a piece of kettle corn, eats it, and it gets lodged in their throat, and they begin to choke. Now, what happens to that rivalry in that moment? In a healthy world, the rivalry disappears. In a healthy world where your guys over here, your attitude isn't just one less Red Sox fan is a good thing, someone on this side who has some kind of medical ability comes running from over here and grabs our choking friend on this side and does something to stop the choking. You don't just sit there and say, they're not in our tribe. That's a good thing. Somewhere in this Abraham story, what God is suggesting is his hope for this community is, yes, the tribalism is important. You will become a community, and you will be a community that lives like me. But somewhere, there's something more. Somewhere there's something for this world that is broken, and you, Abraham, and your family, you will become a part of changing that. Somewhere the rest of the world is choking, and you, Abraham, won't just sit there and watch. You will get involved, and you will do something. This story is way, way back there, right at the beginning. Right at the beginning, this community had an outward focus as well as an inward focus. It wasn't just about being good. It was about being good for the whole world as well. That was what they were there to do. So when you read these stories that we're reading now, these Joshua stories, you are seeing the outworking of both of those things. How do they become a community that's good, inward? How do they become a community that is good for the whole world, outward? And in actual fact, we're going to look at a passage just really briefly in Genesis chapter 15, which talks about exactly this. It's God promising Abraham something that will happen to his community very specifically. Then the Lord said to him, "Know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterwards they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried at a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites," important name, log it in your data bank, "has not yet reached its full measure." We've been reading these stories about this Joshua community that is slowly finding space for itself. And if you're new to faith or outside of faith, these stories can be problematic. They read like genocide. There's this sense of, how can God justify this whole community taking over everyone else's space? But what we see way, way back here is this nation was awful. It was awful way back then, and it had time to change, and it never did. This was a nation that actively practiced child sacrifice. This was a nation that did the most awful things. This Amorite nation that we're reading about the Israelites taking over from, it was a massively problematic way to live. And so when we see this Joshua nation come in, some of what we're seeing is them finding a space to become an inward community. Some of what we're seeing is them figuring out, how do we make a difference in the world around us? How do we be a different nation? It's hard to kind of grasp and wrestle with that sense of, well, is it right that this nation is acting like this? It can be difficult, but we have to do the hard work of getting through it. And what we see is that this isn't all brutality. Sometimes there's nations that Joshua and his friends will encounter where the action is completely different. Sometimes they meet nations that come looking for mercy, and then they get to be that outward-facing nation that God wanted them to be. They get to do something different in the world around them. Have a look at this passage with a group of people called the Gibeonites. This is Joshua chapter 10. When the people of Gibeon heard that what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they resorted to a ruse. They went as a delegation whose donkeys were loaded with worn-out sacks and old wineskins, cracked and mended. They put worn and patched sandals on their feet and wore old clothes. All the bread of their food supply was dry and moldy. Then they went to Joshua in the camp at Gilgal and said to him and the Israelites, "We have come from a distant country. Make a treaty with us." They play a trick on them. They realize that this nation is moving in, that this nation is powerful. It seems that this nation has God on their side, and they take that seriously. So they set up a trap or trick. They take moldy bread and use that as their supplies to make it look like they've traveled for days and days to get there. They wear worn-out sandals, worn-out clothes, and when they arrive, they say to Joshua, "We've come from a distant nation." Joshua and his community have been told, "Be very careful about the other nations around you." In actual fact, and again, hard to read, God has said to them, wipe out these other nations. These other nations will lead you astray. You'll never live as you're supposed to live if you're around these other nations. And the Gibeonites know this, so they trick them. They pretend they come from far away. And Joshua and his friends promise, we won't hurt you. You've come from far away. We'll make a treaty with you. And then there's this moment. They answer Joshua. Joshua says to them, how could you trick us like this? They answered, "Your servants were clearly told how the Lord your God had commanded his servant Moses to give you the whole land and wipe out all its inhabitants before you. So we feared for our lives because of you, and that is why we did this. We are now in your hands. Do to us whatever seems good and right to you." So Joshua saved them from the Israelites, and they did not kill them. That day he made the Gibeonites woodcutters and water carriers for the assembly, to provide for the needs of the altar of the Lord at the place the Lord would choose. And that is what they are to this day. In amongst these stories of brutality, of this nation creating space for itself, of this nation becoming this nation that lives the way God wants them to live, in amongst a group of nations that are living in the worst way imaginable, this one nation comes and, in a weird way, asks for mercy. In a weird way, asks to be joined to this nation. And when that happens, we get to see this one little glimpse of mercy. We get to see this one story of redemption. We get to see this one little sprinkling of this nation become what it was supposed to be all along. A nation that made a difference in the world around it. A nation that was outward focused and accepting of other people. Unfortunately, over the years, what you see happen is the inward focus takes the precedent, and the outward focus almost disappears. Slowly, as this nation grows, slowly it becomes more and more about, it's all about us, and less about the people around them. But when you think about it, and think about what we just learned by watching that short video, isn't that normal? Most organizations, most institutions seem to have like a magnet at its center, and it kind of pulls everything towards that inward-facing thing, and to look outwards can be really difficult. Think about amazing companies that you know in the world. Uber is one as an example. Think about how Uber started. Uber started through what's called disruption. They saw a marketplace and realized they had a chance to do something completely different, something that would revolutionize it. Think about how you ordered a taxi 10 or 15 years ago. You either needed to know a number or you stood in the street and waited till a taxi drove by. But that only really worked in major city centers. Did it really work in a place like Clifton Park? If you wanted a taxi to get somewhere, you needed to have the phone number for a taxi, or you needed one to drive by chance. So Uber saw an opportunity. They saw a chance that they could reach out and they could make a system, an artificial intelligence that would allow you at this moment right now, I can go on my phone and I can order an Uber from here to JFK in one click, and it's done. When you start off, you often start off with that incredible outward focus. We're going to change the world around us. We're going to do something different as a company. But then think about what happens after a while. Now, Uber are the normal way of doing things. Many of you will have used Uber in a big city setting. I've used it hundreds of times. It's the easiest way for me to get a ride from anywhere to somewhere. So, a few months ago, I was stuck in Fort Lauderdale. I needed to get to a supermarket. I had a team of 30 people with me. We were going to be stuck there for a few days. I needed some supplies. The first thing I did was pull out my phone and I called an Uber. That was the normal for me now. And suddenly, Uber as a company is the power. They have been there now for a few years, and suddenly they're the ones that have been doing things that way. How much harder do you think it becomes for Uber to think about new ways of doing something different? All their resources go to protecting what they already have. This happens with companies that go through cycles. Suddenly your company begins to expand, it starts to do new things, and you get to that point of like, do I really want to do this? It was so much more fun when there was just one or two of us in the office. It was so much more fun when I knew exactly, what was going on with everything. I didn't have to think about expansion and all of those things. You get to that point where suddenly you're like, is this really worth it? Is growth worth it? Is change worth it? As a church community, is reaching out worth it? Isn't it so much easier when you know everyone? Isn't it so much easier when it's the size that we've always known it? Isn't it so much easier when I don't have to connect my unchurched friends that I might invite to people that I know in the church community? Isn't it so much easier when I can be one person in a nightclub or a bar in an evening and then one person in a church community on a Sunday morning? That's the temptation that communities, that people go through. Isn't it so much easier to be inward focusing and not outward focusing? Isn't it so much easier to think about America and not everyone else around it? Isn't it so much easier to think about my family and not the other families around me? That temptation is there all the time. It's like there's this magnet inside us that draws us inwards. It draws us inwards to worrying about what we have and protecting that thing. That's what we see happen with this Jewish people. It was always supposed to be outwards. There was this anti-tribal story that was there right at the beginning, this sense of don't just be ethnocentric, be geocentric. Think about the world. Think about that choking Red Sox fan on the other side of the room. But all our nature is wired to that sense of us, us, us. All of our nature is wired to, at best, thinking about me for my community, and to think about my community for the world is a stretch that sometimes we just can't imagine. There's this philosophical problem called the ship of Theseus. Some of you who've studied this kind of thing may have heard of it. The ship of Theseus philosophical problem is this. If Theseus, this Greek hero from many years ago, sails his ship around the world, and during the course of his circumnavigation replaces every single piece of wood on the ship, is it still the same ship? He's changed every single part. Is it still the same ship anymore? And most reasonable people would say, well, of course it's the same ship. I mean, just because he changed all the different pieces of wood, it's still his ship. But there's a counter sort of argument to this problem. It's called the ship of Theseus in a museum. If the ship of Theseus, this famous ship, is in a museum and a gang of thieves break in every night of the year and they take one of the parts of the ship and replace it with a fake part, and then they take the real part and they take it back to their lair or underground cavern or whatever they have, and they rebuild the ship in the other underground cavern. So there's the ship in the museum and the ship in the cavern. Who has the real ship? Well, most people would say the thieves have the real ship. So it seems like when you think about that ship, if it changes all its parts, it shouldn't be the same ship. It's like this mind-messing sort of theological problem. There's a tweak to that I love called Theseus ship in a dry dock. So here's a picture of Theseus ship, and then imagine if we have Theseus ship that's now lodged in a dry dock somewhere on land somewhere. It was built there, and it doesn't move. If Theseus ship is built in a dry dock and never sets sail, is it a ship at all? Is it a ship at all? Or is it just a house that looks kind of like a ship? Is it a building that looks kind of like a ship? What makes a ship a ship? Is it that it looks like what we think a ship should look like, or is it that it sails? If a community doesn't do what it was made to do, has it fundamentally changed itself to the point that it isn't really that thing? If a church isn't outward focused, is it really the thing it's supposed to be anymore? This community that we've watched, this Joshua community, when they stop being outward focused, are they really the thing that they were supposed to be at all? Because think about a ship. The safest place for a ship is in a dock. But that's not what ships are for. They're not made for that. They're made to sail. They're made to be on the water. And if it doesn't do that, is it really a ship? This Joshua community, if they don't reach out, if they aren't outward focused, are they ever really the community they were supposed to be? Because God told them way back in this early part, obey everything that I've told you to do. Unfortunately, the laws that they focused on were the ones that were very inward. They were able to focus on things like don't cut your hair past a certain point. The hair on the side of your face, you guys, make sure you leave it. The edges of the beard, don't trim it. Those things they were able to do. But then 3 verses after this came this verse. When a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself. For you were foreigners in Egypt. I am the Lord your God. They got the first one, but they couldn't get the second one, and it's only 4 lines down the paper. What happens when a community misses that fundamental sense of who it is? If a church misses those fundamental sense of what is our nature, are we really a church? Because if there's one thing the first followers of Jesus were, it was outward focusing. They had this part down. Yes, we looked last week, they were this incredible inward community. They had this incredible sense of, it is me for my community. They had that down well. But they also understood, this is my community for the world. There is something that we're able to do that could be revolutionary. Look at this story. This is a guy called Philip. He's part of this New Testament church, and God does a couple of incredible things. He just starts speaking to Philip and say, go, just go somewhere. Go to the south to the road, the desert road that goes from Jerusalem to Gaza. So he started out, and on his way he met an Ethiopian eunuch, an important official in charge of all the treasury of the Kandake. That's the queen of the Ethiopians. This man had gone to Jerusalem to worship, and on his way home was sitting in his chariot reading the book of Isaiah the prophet. The Spirit told Philip, go to that chariot and stay near it. Then Philip ran up to the chariot and heard the man reading Isaiah the prophet. Do you understand what you are reading? Philip asked. How can I, he said, unless someone explains it to me? So he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. This is the passage of scripture the eunuch was reading. He was led like a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. In his humiliation, he was deprived of justice. Who can speak of his descendants? For his life was taken from the earth. The eunuch asked Philip, tell me please, who is the prophet talking about, himself or someone else? Then Philip began with that very passage of scripture and told him the good news about Jesus. Philip meets an outsider, someone who doesn't belong for very specific reasons. Yes, it says he's been to Jerusalem to worship, but this man is a eunuch. That means that his body parts have been damaged in some way. It doesn't necessarily mean that he doesn't have a penis or anything like that. It just means that in some way he is considered a broken person. And there were very specific laws in the Old Testament that said that person isn't allowed inside the temple. There's no entry to that person. So this guy had gone all the way to Jerusalem. He'd traveled thousands of miles, and he'd been told, no entry here. Stop. You are not allowed in. Maybe to the outer courts, but to the inner part, to God's presences, you're not welcome here. He'd gone all that way to be told no entry. Think about the emotion there. Think about what that would have meant to him. That must have been heartbreaking. And then think about him on that journey back, that return journey back to his homeland, processing all of that, and then picking up this book to read. And reading the story, the prophecy about who Jesus would be and what he would do, this idea that Jesus would be broken for our sins, that he would be mistreated for everything that we had done wrong. And think about Philip unpacking that to him. And what I would love to believe is in this moment where Philip starts to talk about this story of grace and what Jesus means for this person, I'd love to think that he carried on just a couple of chapters later, because in the Jewish Old Testament, there were no chapter marks, there were no stopping points, it just flowed on. This was the book of Isaiah, and I'd love to think he went from 53 through to chapter 56, because this is what it says there. Let no foreigner who is bound to the Lord say, the Lord will surely exclude me from his people. And let no eunuch complain, I am only a dry tree. For this is what the Lord says to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose what pleases me and hold fast to my covenant. To them I will give them my temple and its walls, a memorial and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that will endure forever. I'd love to think that he took this eunuch just a couple of chapters later and let him see that as an outsider, he didn't have to stay as an outsider. If there was one thing this New Testament church did, they stayed outward focused. It was all about my community for the world, and they did this repeatedly. In actual fact, the early church became famous for one thing: incredible acts of compassion towards people that didn't belong to them or to anybody else. They became famous for the fact that if a child was left on the streets, the New Testament church would take that child in. They became famous for reaching out to people that were broken, that were lonely, that were hurting. They became famous for being outward focused. It's probably that reason that Christianity was able to become the dominant religion in that area so quickly. In just a couple of hundred years, the Roman religion of the day was essentially wiped out because people saw in this New Testament church something that was different to the way that everybody else operated. They were shamelessly outward focused. There's this verse on the next slide that kind of sums up, keep going, next one. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. This was a group of people that constantly reached out across divides, constantly built bridges. Some of you, good New Yorkers, I'm sure at some point have been to Niagara Falls. I got to go to Niagara Falls for the first time a few years ago, and it's just this wonder that you step there and you kind of saddened a little bit that it's got all this tourism stuff around it because it feels like it should be this supernatural experience of walking out next to this incredible waterfall, and yet actually you get the sound of like the arcades in the background, and it just feels very kitschy, and you're kind of like, this isn't how it's supposed to be. But it's now over 150 years since this place started becoming one of the big tourist attractions. People would come from miles to see Niagara Falls in all of its glory. And one guy came up with an idea. We're going to put a bridge across this river. Now, when he first came up with it, his name was Joseph Roebling. He was laughed at. This is a picture of him right here, I think. He was laughed at. How do you put a bridge across something that's this wide? This waterfall is so powerful. It's constantly moving the geography because of how much water comes through. How can you put a bridge across this? For a start, there was just no way of reaching the other side from the side that you were standing on. You had to get a ferry across it. You know that Maid of the Mist journey that you can get on? Those were actually working ferries at some point. They actually had a purpose other than just taking you slightly closer to the waterfall. But he came up with this idea and said, I'm going to make this happen. So he started this sense of, how can we do this? And he realized that the first step was getting something across the other side of the bridge. Didn't have to be across the other side of the river. Didn't have to be a bridge to start with. He just had to get something over the other side. But it was too far to shoot an arrow. Couldn't shoot one that far. It was too far to shoot a cannon. Someone talked about tying a piece of string to a cannon shot and firing that across. Didn't work. Someone said, could we sail a piece of string across? But when you got to the other side, there was just 225 feet of straight cliff. Didn't really help. You couldn't just get the other side and start climbing. So they came up with a plan. He started a competition of kite flyers. He said to all the kids in the area, grab a kite, go to the edge of Niagara, and I will give $10 to the first person that can get a kite from one side to the other. Now, to the people of the day, $10 was a huge amount of money. So suddenly, there's hundreds of kids that are out there trying to land their kites on the other side of the river. Nobody can get it done until one American kid decides the best way to do it is to cross to the Canadian side. So off he goes to the Canadian side where the prevailing winds are, and he flies his kite all day long, just waiting for midnight when he knows that the winds will drop and the kite will fall. And so he's there hour after hour after hour, and suddenly has that heartbreaking moment where the kite string goes slack, and he knows that the string's been cut. He waits day, waiting for the next high wind, sends his kite back up again, and finally has that moment where he sees this kite drop at night and land on the other side of the river. The first thing to cross the Niagara River wasn't a bridge. It was a kite string. And Roebling used this kite string, and he attached a piece of wire to it and pulled the piece of wire back the other side, and they put a cage on it, and they had the first crossing of someone hanging in a cage going along this wire to the other side of this great river. And then they put in the first bridge system, and then finally a suspension bridge system that went all the way across the river. And Roebling had his great moment where he got to say, right, now we're going to send a train across. And everyone said, I'm not riding on that train. That's crazy. But he sent this slow train across at 8 miles an hour to the other side of the Niagara River, and now people cross it every single day without thinking about it. But it started with someone who saw a vision for a bridge. But before he could build a bridge, he had to get a wire across. And before he could get a wire across, he had to get a string across. And that started with a kid who liked flying kites and would stand all night on the side of the river waiting for the kite to drop on the other side. He saw a divide that didn't seem crossable and said, I'm going to cross it anyway. That's the sort of thing this first Jesus community was interested in asking. How can we cross divides? How can you and I be people that build bridges across divides? That has different applications, doesn't it? It has the application of the church as a community. How do we think about bridging those divides to other parts of the world? How do we be a church that takes seriously what we would call the missional focus? How do we take seriously the idea that there are people right now that are struggling all over the world, and we get to be a part of changing that? This world, this church should be fundamentally something that makes a difference in all of the world. But it also has this personal application too, right? It has this sense of you and I have relationships outside of here. And we are called to use those relationships to bring people closer to this Jesus that loves them, that they may not know yet, but they may know one day. It may not start with a bridge, it may start with a kite string, but that's what we are made to do. We are made to be shamelessly outward focused in the sense of who we are as a community. How do we do that well? Because as we saw earlier, every community after a while starts to look more and more to the inward. How do we keep our hair cut to the appropriate length or not cut it to the appropriate length? We never ask those questions about how we reach outwards if we allow ourselves to relax. And so as we've walked through this series, as we close up and we get ready to eat some bacon, because I know you can smell it, how do we do that practically? We've tried to look at these ideas of different spiritual disciplines each week that help us just kind of start to think about those directions. And so the list that we looked at is here. We looked at lament for week 1, that sense of like grief. Presence in week 2 is this intentional recognizing that God is present with us. Petition is this intentional prayer, asking God to give us wisdom for the next steps. And the examine is this thing that we looked at last week. It's this contemplative practice that enables us to look inwards and identify some of our emotions and why we're responding the way we are to different things. But the final one I would give you is this. It's this sense of compassion. Now, compassion obviously is an act, but it starts with this process of taking some time to identify people in your life that God might be calling you to reach out to. It starts by taking this intentional time to think through, who are we as a community going to try and work amongst? Is there an organization that we feel called to? This is an intentional process. Every single one of you has people in your life that you are called to reach out to. It may be something as simple as taking them a meal when they need it, of buying them coffee when they need it. It can be something as simple as that, but it can also be this real practical introduction to who Jesus is. Every one of you has a story, something that God has done in your life, and you are called to share that story with the world around you. You are called to build bridges, and when you cross those bridges, you help change the world around you. So we're going to remember the fact that this is part of our story. This is ingrained in who we are as a community from the earliest moment. It was ingrained in this earliest moment when Jesus picked 12 followers and said, I'm going to send you to the world around you. Philip's story is just an extension of that story. Our stories are just extensions of those stories. When we take communion, we're remembering this Jesus who commanded us not to be inward focused, but to become outward focused, to ask how we can take his story, not just to Clifton Park, but to the ends of the world.